In a world where 2D animation is the type of animation we all apparently miss, and where 3D animation seems to mainly be valued in top-tier Disney and Pixar movies, there's an old genre of strange and off-looking 3D animation slipping through the cracks of what we deem worth watching. A cult classic for the ones who grew up wearing pigtails and pink tutus, and for the ones who didn't but really wanted to. You know what I'm talking about by now, right? Yes, it's Happily Never After 2.
Interesting artifact.
Kidding. It's Barbie Fairytopia. I still remember the first time I noticed the existence of the first movie. I browsed the aisles of the DVD section of my local mall with my parents. All I could see were boring movies for old decrepit people over 16 and animated kids movies with colorful covers, but not the rainbow unicorn kind of colorful. You know, they were something more like this. And then I saw it, an unapologetically pink, sparkly, iridescent light coming from a corner, the 3D animated Barbie movies. Now, mind you, I was a bit of an emo kid. One time we had to draw ourselves as a design for t-shirts at school, and while everyone else was drawing themselves as fairies and princesses, I drew myself as a tattooed prisoner in jail. I was not like other 6-year-old girls, but no girl in 2005 was immune to the power of Barbie Fairytopia. The pinks were the right color of pink. The sparkle sparkled perfectly, and Bibble, which is actually the correct way to spell Bible in case you didn't know. Fast forward to 2021. I'm in a class about the history of cinema in college. Men all around me are talking about how The Godfather is the best trilogy ever made. The testosterone-filled air is making it harder and harder to breathe, and so I decide to fight back. My voice trembles, but nonetheless, I say, have you ever seen Barbie Fairytopia? All men suddenly turn quiet. My girlfriends look at me, and they start agreeing. I hear mentions of Bibble, of Barbie Mermaidia, of the clear chemistry between Nori and Elena, and the air clears up again. My lungs fill up with glitter and rainbows. All is well. A few days later, I tell my friends, hey, we should watch Fairytopia again. And so we did. And what the heck is this?
Yay! But
why are there like no characters in the background? Are arms like that really healthy to have? I swear I remembered the movie like this and not like this. Okay, just kidding. There are prettier shots in the movie. What are those two-dimensional flowers? After finishing the movie though, we had to admit that we kind of loved how stupidly bad the animation was. The empty, computer-generated, pixelated spaces and ambiances, the awkward movements and pauses of the characters, and some of the scary-ass looking character designs. Lately, I've been seeing the 3D Barbie movie aesthetic pop up again on social media, whether it's for memes or nostalgia bait. But most people in the comments seem to remember the movies fondly, and the aesthetic is becoming something of a niche. Are our minds just drunk on senseless nostalgia, or is this strange aesthetic that the Barbie movies created actually kinda slay? Barbie is a fashion doll manufactured by Mattel, which has been featured in 52 animated feature films and streaming television movies since 2001. When the late 1980s showed a gradual decline of sales in toys and dolls, the company partnered with animation studios to produce movies broadcasted on Nickelodeon in the US, and which were also released on home video formats like VHS and DVD. So vintage. These movies are usually titled something like Barbie and the Nutcracker or Barbie and the 12 Dancing Princesses, since Barbie is supposed to be the actress in the movie, while the character she plays has her own name. From 2001 to 2009, they adapted already existing tales with the use of CGI animation provided by Mainframe Entertainment, a Canadian studio, and Elise Allen created some original stories like our beloved Barbie Fairytopia series. Fairytopia was the first Barbie movie with an original plot, and the doll lines went crazy, of course. While Disney, for example, usually produces its animated movies first and the merchandising second, the animated Barbie movies were basically created as long-form advertisements for their new doll lines. In 2004, Disney Pixar released The Incredibles, a 3D animated movie that appears much newer than Barbie Fairytopia, but Fairytopia actually came out a year later in 2005. The Incredibles had a budget of $92 million US, and while the budget for Fairytopia hasn't been publicly disclosed, I suspect it was a bit lower. And so I don't think it's really fair to to compare them too much since they were clearly created in different conditions and for different purposes. While I have seen some people on Reddit writing that they used motion capture to make the first Barbie movies, that's actually false. The first Barbie movie actually made with motion capture, which uses the movements of real actors and dancers like in Avatar, was Barbie: A Mermaid's Tale from 2012. Like most other 3D animated movies from the early 2000s, for the Barbie movies they use computer animation, a technique that involves creating 3D models of characters and environments, animating their movements, and rendering them into final images. As you can imagine, if it's already hard nowadays to give 3D animations fluidity and natural movement, well, it couldn't have been easier for a straight-to-DVD movie released in 2005. There was a film from 2006 called The Barbie Diaries, which was the only film not made by the studio Rainmaker but by Curious Pictures, which explains the completely different art style and its modern setting. Even though the original Princess and Fairy movies would continue to be made up until about 2009, The Barbie Diaries was probably a coincidental indicator of where the Barbie movies would be heading in the 2010s. From 2010 to late 2014, there was a clear switch in focus from the classic princess tales to more modern settings and plots involving fashion, music, and Barbie's family and friends. The catalyst was that in 2009, they had to scrap Barbie as Sleeping Beauty because Disney trademarked the name Princess Aurora, which was a name that was already being used in the marketing for the Barbie dolls released in Asian and European markets. The movie's direction started to slowly drift away from the princess image they were known for, since they wanted to create more empowering movies set in modern times. They even remade The Princess and the Pauper and named it The Princess and the Pop Star. Visually, the shift is huge. The color palettes in the early Barbie movies were mostly pastel, and the 3D molds for Barbie and most of the main characters had feminine and delicate features. In the 2010s though, the color schemes became flashy and neon, and the 3D molds looked more like the actual dolls. The face molds were similar from film to film, but still quite different in an uncanny way. Barbie Video Game Hero, released in 2017, was the 35th Barbie movie and the last to be originally released on home video formats and broadcast on television in the US. From 2017 onwards, Mattel used the rise of streaming media services to revamp the 3D Barbie films into streaming television movies, predominantly released on Netflix. You may ask yourself, what did she do to find information on this? Well, I went on Reddit. Of course I did. Now, I know these are just some random comments on the internet. Sadly, there are no official sociological studies on the 3D Barbie movies, and although I personally believe this to be a huge gap on our society's sociological knowledge, I don't see that changing anytime soon. These posts are all I have right now to kind of give me a general idea of what other people's opinions on this topic might be, so enjoy. First, I read a post by user SevereExpression710 on r/Barbie titled, "I really want Mattel to remake the classic Barbie movies with better graphics." User Addicted to Color agreed and commented that they even felt slightly nauseous because of the animation. Others had a different opinion though. User NoRing528 thinks that the fact that they look like PS2 animations is a positive quality, and that a remake would probably lose the elegance of the original animation. User Regina Phalange 322 also said that the older 3D molds for the faces looked more adult-like and that they wouldn't like a saturated color palette. On a similar post by Mahmoud1045 titled "What Made the Old Barbie Movie So Special?" user Bridge Eddy replied, "They focused on telling a strong story and had very memorable visuals, voice acting, and scoring. The best ones had a good foundation in the form of an established story they could reference." Likewise, user WeirdAbrocoma7835 commented that they think that nowadays the budget is put into better rendering instead of the writing. Lastly, there was a comment by user Elise Moon that mentioned lack of technology and therefore more magic. And this is what caught my attention the most. Sometimes low budgets can ruin projects, especially if they were written for the standards of big productions and aren't properly modified to fit the style of a lower budget movie. But if a movie is created with a low budget in mind from the very start, has a solid base of good writing, and the team knows the limits of the technology they're going to be using, they can get really creative with it. In the early Barbie movies, the art direction was quite homogeneous, making the aesthetic very soft, elegant, and feminine with pastel colors, dainty dresses, and very magical ambiances. If they had used more neon colors, like in the 2010s, the bad quality of the graphics would have probably been a lot more noticeable. It's like the pastel colors give the movies a beauty filter. Also, since writing completely original and engaging stories is difficult and probably riskier as it's easier to get people to watch something they already kind of know, they mostly did adaptations, which increase the possibilities of not making it suck. Now, this does kind of explain why the early 3D Barbie movies were better than the usual doll or toy advertisements. But does it explain the recent resurgence of people's interest in these movies? No, what it does is that the kids who watched those movies in their childhoods are now old enough to make memes on the internet about them. But also, and this is just speculation, so feel free to disagree with me in the comments, I feel like some of the defining factors for the newfound love for these movies are the current online trends and the fixation on aesthetics. Call me crazy, but I doubt that anyone who's not chronically online is thinking about 2000s Barbie movies too much. You may love your childhood movies, but if you reference Preminger a lot, it's probably because you're an avid consumer of Preminger and Sporticus edits.
Sorry, that'd be fun.
Or Preminger and Lord Farquaad. Whatever rocks your boat, girl. The awkward animation in the movies just makes for really great memes, and the obsession we have online with categorizing and finding new aesthetics has truly given the Barbie movies a new life. It's not difficult to find Pinterest boards and TikToks that include stills from the Barbie movies in lists of images that are supposed to be coquette or fairycore. I typed Barbie Fairytopia aesthetic on Pinterest to see what would come up, and I got a mixed array of stills from the movie and non-related pictures that match the movie's aesthetic and are tagged as #Barbie Fairytopia. Apart from the internet-related popularity and connection to the world of cute aesthetics though, I do think the strange low-quality animation style of the movies is what tugs on nostalgia the most, whether you think it's good or awful to the eyes. And the unapologetically girly, soft pastel and magical 3D worlds the early Barbie movies created may be more interesting in an artistic sense than we initially thought. But let's not get too ahead. Let's start first with our seemingly irrational love for strange-looking CGI. The other day, I found a really cool subreddit called Vintage CGI with 34,000 members where users regularly post really cool images of old CGI and video game posters, box art, music videos, and even a Packard Bell Navigator from 1995. While I don't know if this subreddit would categorize the Barbie movies as vintage, I've read some posts on there that nevertheless ring quite true in regards to the CGI of the Barbie movies. Under a post titled "What is the appeal of vintage CGI to you?" user Yehosafat Lacaz writes, "Why be so interested in what many people would simply call bad CGI?" The user then gives some of his own personal reasons and theories, some of them being nostalgia, uncanniness, and the fact that vintage CGI wasn't afraid to look computer made. As you know, and according to the Dictionary of Cambridge, nostalgia is a feeling of pleasure and also slight sadness when we think about things that happened in the past. Nostalgia can be deceiving though. A few studies have found that we tend to remember the highlights and forget the low points of things. Our memories can become idealized through the rose-tinted glasses of nostalgia, and the emotional connection to past experiences can make them seem better than they actually were. We do this because nostalgia usually feels good, and it's probably a valid reason for why I remembered Barbie Fairytopia like this and not like this, and also why we enjoy the old-fashioned CGI of the movies, even if more recent ones may have better quality. Regarding uncanniness, the Reddit user mentions, "There is just something so strange and unnatural about a lot of these images. They are facsimiles of reality that just sort of fail at actually replicating the real world, creating something new. There is a strong resemblance to the feelings I get from r/liminal space." The uncanny valley is a psychological phenomenon where highly realistic representations of humans or other living beings can evoke a sense of eeriness or unease when they are almost perfect but not quite perfect. You know that something's not right, but you can't pinpoint what it is. In early CGI, factors like limited polygon counts, artificial textures, and unnatural movements usually contributed to an uncanny appearance. I love the Polar Express, but as you know, it's the perfect example. There's a difference between this and this though. Stuff in Barbie movies can get really uncanny, but the main characters usually aren't, unless their eyes get wonky. They are stylized properly enough to where you understand that they are not supposed to resemble humans perfectly, but rather dolls. One of the most uncanny but fun parts to look at in Barbie movies are probably the setting and background designs, which, like the user mentioned, have a strong resemblance to liminal spaces, which are unsettling or dreamlike locations that are usually empty. In Barbie Fairytopia, these settings show up a lot. Alina, the main character, lives in the Magic Meadow, a place that's supposedly the home of a bunch of fairies, but it looks empty all the time. On the foreground, there's usually some fairy flying around, but don't expect anything to be happening in the background. What's interesting is that, from what I've found, liminal spaces are usually defined as eerily familiar and nostalgic. Why do these images give off liminality then? They don't really look like anything I've seen in real life. Well, a big part of liminal images is that they usually depict transitional spaces, the in-between places we pass through from one area to another. In real life, those are hallways, waiting rooms, parking lots, and in these stills from Barbie Fairytopia, most of the places depicted resemble tunnels or hallways. The quote-unquote natural settings still feel uncanny and unsettling though. To me, that's because of two things. One, I know for a fact that these spaces are completely empty because they are computer generated, and the flat graphics don't really help me think otherwise. They feel abandoned. And two, they remind me of the transitional areas in the games I used to play as a child, like Zelda or Spyro. You had to pass through them to get to your destination, and unless there were NPCs or mobs intentionally placed or spawned there, those spaces could be completely empty. You also never knew when or if a mob would appear, so there was always this feeling of uncertainty. But anyways, lastly, as the user mentioned, vintage CGI usually wasn't afraid to look like it was made with computers. Most CGI nowadays is also totally stylized, but back then it was basically impossible to create an almost perfect replica of reality because technology just wasn't developed enough to do so. And that created its own art form. Compared to the present day, old CGI is usually quite minimalistic and abstract, leaving a lot to the viewer to fill in with their imagination. And for kids' movies, like the Barbie ones, that's kind of perfect. While there's no definite consensus yet, I've read some studies suggesting that children between the ages of 2 and 5 often prefer simpler 3D animations over those with excessive detail. Whether you think the CGI is bad or just vintage, its strange look heavily impacted the aesthetic of the Barbie movies we know and love. Some may enjoy them because of their soft girliness and pastel color palettes, but without the look of the CGI, they could have just looked like copies of movies like The Last Unicorn or Sleeping Beauty. The randomly unique looking character designs, Barbie's elegance, the color palettes, and the magical settings and stories, mixed with the 3D, the flat artificial textures, the fuzzy image quality, and sloppy movements, introduced a new girly magical aesthetic that was relatively new to the 3D animation at the time. Some of the 3D animated films up until about 2001 shared similar themes of friendship and adventure, such as Toy Story and A Bug's Life, but none had given us such an unapologetically girly aesthetic filled with feminine characters and themes as the 3D Barbie movies did. And because of that, I do think they are still quite slay.
Slay!